To our well, welcome everybody. Welcome to today's event. It's great to have you here with participants from all corners of the world. Really want to thank you for coming and acknowledge you for being here. Some of you very early in the morning and some of you very, very late at night. If you are in the room, if you could please mute your record your phone, that will really help us with the audio quality. Super. Now, the audio for today's event will be simultaneous translation into French and Spanish and Arabic. Please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen to select your preferred language.
Sorry, could I?
I've just muted everybody. It would be great if you could all keep your microphones off, and that will really help us with the audio. Super. So do click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and you can select your preferred language. I hope that will be helpful for you all. Now, I appreciate that some of you have been on this journey with us since 2019, and for others, this might be your very first IFR4NPO event. So we will start with a brief background to the consultation and the project before we dive in to look at who we received responses from. And after a Q&A, we'll then spend the bulk of our time focusing on the feedback from part 1 of the consultation. And then after a Q&A, we will look at the responses to part 2 of the consultation, but this will be at a more overview level since that deeper analysis is still underway. Finally, we have an exciting announcement to make at the end about the name of the guidance and information about how you can give feedback on the exposure drafts. Now, we're really keen to hear from you at various points throughout our time together today. Please do use the reaction buttons at the bottom of your screen. There's reactions. Maybe you want to test it now. You can use the thumbs up if you agree with something. And if you search for thumb, you'll see the thumbs down one. And there's also no underscore mouth, which is that middle symbol there, could be helpful if you don't have a strong feeling either way. So I don't know if you want to have a quick practice now, try and do a thumbs up or a no mouth or a thumbs down as just practice to see if you can use those reaction buttons, which we'll use later on. Can't see if anyone's using them. Is anyone using them? Have a practice and see if you can click those. Oh, I can see, brilliant. Okay, so some thumbs up, some no mouths and some claps. Everyone's being very kind and not putting a thumbs down. Super. And it really helps us to use those because we can't see all your faces, and it'll just help us to have an idea. We'll also have 2 question and answer or comments and answer sections. And during that, if you can use the raise hand function, so that you can ask a question or make a comment. And the chat function is also available, and we'll do our best to monitor comments there during the event, and we'll also look at them afterwards. As I mentioned, if you can edit your Zoom name to include your name and country, and that would be great. And also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And we're so glad that you've joined us here today. So today's session will be presented by myself. I'm Samantha Msoke, the project director for Humantum, for IFR4NPO Humantum based in Uganda. And I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues at CIPFA, at the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. That is Karen Sanderson, and also Philip Trotter, who's an associate. Really delighted. Now, having said, we'll start with a brief background and about the project and the consultation process. The project, the IFR4NPO project, exists to develop internationally applicable financial reporting guidance for non-profit organizations. We call them NPOs. And there are 3 stated objectives for the guidance. The first is to improve the quality, transparency and credibility of NPO financial reports. The second is to support the provision of NPO financial information that's useful for decision-making and accountability, but balancing the needs of preparers and users. And then the third objective is to address NPO-specific issues, and we hope that will promote increased comparability for NPO financial reports. And it's so important for us to have these objectives in mind, as they're really the starting point for everything that we're doing as a project. Which financial reports? Now, because NPOs produce so many different types of financial reports, it's really important to clarify right at the beginning that the guidance that we're developing is for general purpose financial reports. Therefore, an NPO entity as a whole, they're sometimes called the annual audited accounts. That's what this whole project and the focus of today's event is focusing on. In terms of the process, the guidance is being developed in a three-step process, which is equivalent to all other international accounting standard setters. The output from the consultation phase was the consultation paper, and it's the feedback from this that we'll be presenting today. The next phase will be the development of the guidance for public comment as exposure drafts. And then before we finalize the guidance ready for its planned launch in 2025. So that's an idea of the time frame for the project. In terms of the consultation process itself, we began back in October 2019 when we started drafting the consultation paper with input from our advisory groups. So the practitioner advisory group brings views and perspectives from a wide range of stakeholders, while the technical advisory group, which is drawn from national standard setters, they debate and advise on the project outputs. So the consultation paper was launched in January of last year. Part 1 was closed for comment on the 13th of August and part 2 on the 7th of October. And during that period, we engaged with stakeholders around the world, and everyone was invited to submit their responses. Since August, we've been analysing those responses, formulating the proposed ways forward, and getting input from the advisory groups so that we could bring you this presentation today. Now, overall, about 1,000 people from 96 countries engaged with our events in 4 languages, which we were delighted with. And we received 208 formal written responses from individuals and organizations in 33 countries. Now, the pie chart here shows the regional distribution of respondents for both part 1 and part 2. And you can see it's healthily diverse, shall we say, much as we are continuing to work to improve our outreach to the less engaged parts of the world. Every single response that we received is a matter of public record, and they can all be viewed on the project website at the link shown below, www.ifr4npo.org/cp-response. So if you're interested, you can see them all there. Now, this pie chart here was for the entire consultation paper. Now we're going to narrow in just for part 1. And for the next half an hour or so, we'll be looking at the responses to part 1. So part 1 of the consultation paper focused on landscape level issues. There were 89 respondents, with 67% telling us that they were responding on their own behalf, as individuals sharing their personal opinions. And then 33% of responses were submitted on behalf of organizations. Now, both forms of responses are really important and valid, but looking forward to future consultations, we are hoping to increase the number of responses from individuals, from organizations, to increase the responses from organizations. Now, to that end, we are interested to identify organization champions, we're calling them, who could take a lead in developing responses for their organization to future consultations. These responses would then be submitted formally on behalf of an organisation, or perhaps just of a country office if it's a very large international organisation. There's an informal description of the role, a link there, which you can follow afterwards. And we can also provide some help and support to organisation champions in their role. So if you might be interested to explore that, then please let me know in the chat now, or you can email me later and we can explore that further. Okay, moving on, in terms of respondents to the CP. In terms of the role of the people who responded, they represented a variety of roles in the sector and a variety of stakeholder types. So we can see NPO finance staff and trustees, accountancy bodies and auditors, as well as standard setters, academics, and others. And then the responses by region, specifically for part 1, show a similar trend as what we saw to the consultation as a whole. We had the highest response rates from East and Southern Africa, Europe, West and Central Africa, and Southeast Asia. And we will be working with our project's country champions to improve engagement in the other regions as well. It is so important that we receive input from a wide range of stakeholders and countries so that the guidance development process can consider the full range of priorities and viewpoints and have the best chance of being relevant and useful for all involved. Now, before I hand over to Philip, let's remind ourselves of the different topics and questions that were in the consultation paper. Part 1 was about these landscape level concerns. The links there shown on the slide take you to the consultation paper itself. And there's also a popular set of pages with videos on each of the accounting issues. So we're going to be looking at how do we decide whether an entity is an NPO? Who are NPOs? Who are the stakeholders that use NPO financial reports? What are their information needs? What are the issues relating to accrual basis guidance? When considering non-financial narrative reporting aspects, how prescriptive should the guidance be? What were your views on using existing international accounting frameworks as a starting point? And finally, we'll share your feedback on the bespoke development model that we proposed using IFRS for SME as a base. Now, for each of these, we'll look briefly at what we proposed in the consultation paper and the question that we asked, followed by a summary of what respondents said and what we're going to do in general terms. So, Phil, over to you.
Thanks, Sam, and hello to everyone. So, chapter 1 of the consultation paper looked at what is meant by the term NPOs. This was to enable an examination of which organisations' financial reports might be addressed by the project's first objective, improving the quality, transparency, and credibility of NPO financial reports. The consultation paper proposed a broad characteristics approach to describing the entities that the guidance is expected to primarily benefit. NPOs were described as organisations that deliver services for public benefit and/or direct any profit surpluses for public benefit and/or may have significant voluntary funding and grant income and/or hold and use assets for social purposes. The aim of this description was to enable a project focus on proposals that best meet the needs of the organisations with some or all of these characteristics. We asked whether you agreed with the broad characteristics proposed for describing a non-profit organisation. Now, in total, 80% of responses were in agreement with the proposals, with a further 11% of responses partially in agreement. You said that using broad characteristics was a good way of describing non-profit organisations, but there were some differences of opinion as to whether we had proposed the correct characteristics. Concerns were raised as to whether some NPOs would be inadvertently excluded and other entities inadvertently included. Some respondents also questioned whether some of the characteristics should not be seen as indicators of other characteristics rather than as characteristics in their own right. There was a strong agreement that an NPO exists for the public benefit, but there was also some disagreement as to how this should be defined. Now, as a result of this feedback, we are proposing to reduce the number of broad characteristics, with NPOs expected to demonstrate them all. Other indicators will assist in determining if an entity is an NPO, where it is not clear if these characteristics have been met. So if we look at the proposals, NPOs will be described as entities that are not controlled by government, that have the primary objective of providing goods and/or services for public benefit, and that direct profit surpluses for public benefit. Now, depending on the goods and services provided by the NPO, the section of the public that the NPO benefits could be quite limited. But where this is the case, we would expect the other indicators will need to be checked to determine if the entity can be described as an NPO. These other indicators are still under development, but may include voluntary funding and grant income, because for many NPOs, the provision and receipt of voluntary funding through donations, grants, or volunteering of services may be significant to the entity. The purpose and use of assets, because NPOs hold assets primarily to assist in delivering goods and services for public benefit and not to generate financial returns to providers of resources, and rights to financial returns and transfer of residual net assets upon dissolution. Because an indicator that an entity is likely to be an NPO includes an absence of individuals having rights to financial returns and a requirement that upon dissolution of the entity, any residual net assets have to be transferred to an entity with a similar purpose. Now, if we now look at Chapter 2 of the consultation paper, this examined NPO stakeholders and their accountability and decision-making requirements. This was to assist in the achievement of Objective 2 of the project, which is to support the provision of NPO financial information that is useful for decision-making and accountability, balancing the needs of preparers and users. It was proposed that NPOs are accountable to service users, resource providers, and regulators, and that they have a wider societal accountability. We asked if you agreed with these proposed groups of stakeholders. Now, in total, 82% of responses were in agreement with the proposals, with a further 14% of responses partially in agreement. A number of respondents did, however, indicate that the focus on external stakeholders meant that recognition had not been given to internal stakeholders who are also important in the NPO context. Examples provided by these respondents of internal stakeholders, including those charged with governance, staff, volunteers, and members. Given the broad accountability perspective of the chapter and the nature of many NPOs, we agree that some stakeholders who may traditionally be seen as internal in nature should be better recognized. In the NPO context, this would include, for example, groups such as non-executive governing boards. So we are proposing to examine how the needs of these groups can be reflected. Now, the conceptual basis of international frameworks for general purpose financial reporting define primary users as those who do not possess the authority to require an entity to disclose the information they need. In the NPO context, primary users could therefore be the public to whom the NPO provides goods and services, resource providers, and those fulfilling oversight functions on their behalf, who do not possess the authority to require an NPO to disclose the information they need for accountability and decision-making purposes. While internal stakeholders, like those charged with governance, will be users of the NPO's general purpose financial reports, they would generally not be seen as primary users, as they would be expected to have the authority to request information tailored to their own specific needs. This will be an important consideration as we examine how the needs of internal stakeholders can be reflected as we move towards a specific focus on the objectives on NPO financial reporting and the information needs of users. Now, Chapter 2 also examined the information needs of the external stakeholders identified. It proposed that external stakeholders need to know that an NPO is achieving its objectives in a way that maximizes economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in the use of resources, while complying with restrictions and regulations, and in the context of its longer-term financial health. We asked if you agreed with the information needs proposed for external stakeholders. Now, in total, 87% of responses were in agreement with the proposals, with a further 6% of responses partially in agreement. Several respondents did, though, question the information needs that were presented and provided arguments for some that had not been included. This related, in particular, to an apparent absence of the outcomes achieved by the NPO, the view that stakeholders needed to understand whether an NPO was maximising economy, efficiency and effectiveness in the use of resources, and a narrow focus on long-term financial health. Now, we had intended that outcomes be partly covered under achievement of objectives, but the number of respondents who identified an issue would indicate that from their perspective, this was not adequately covered. With respect to economy, efficiency and effectiveness, while most respondents did agree that value for money considerations have at least some relevance to NPOs, a term such as optimization was preferred to maximization to better reflect how resources are used to support activities and achieve outcomes in the NPO context. The focus on long-term financial sustainability was also raised by several respondents, who questioned whether stakeholders would also not expect to see areas such as risk, long-term strategy and plans, and environmental sustainability covered. These respondents supported a broader sustainability perspective beyond that was presented in the consultation paper. A number of the respondents also expressed the viewpoint that the focus of the chapter was not sufficiently tied to financial reporting. Their view was that rather than articulate accountability needs from a broad perspective, it should be focused specifically from the perspective of general purpose financial reports. For these respondents, the chapter's broad perspective did not allow for a specific focus on the objectives of financial reporting and financial statements. For some, this meant there was an insufficient emphasis placed on the role that financial statements play in demonstrating accountability and stewardship, with instead too much emphasis on decision-making usefulness. This had led for them to a lack of acknowledgement that areas such as the use of restricted funds was crucial in demonstrating accountability for many NPOs. It was also argued that the broad perspective meant that the primary users of NPO financial statements, which would be important for the development of the guidance, had not been well articulated. Of the key stakeholder groups highlighted, some respondents argued they would typically and appropriately obtain information by other means rather than through general purpose financial reports. For these respondents, it was necessary to determine those for whom information would be most appropriately provided to through financial statements. Now, we agree with many of these comments, and as already highlighted, as the project moves to the exposure draft stage, we will determine who the primary users of NPO general purpose financial reports are and be articulating the financial and non-financial information needs of those users, specifically with reference to general purpose financial reports. And I will now pass back to Sam.
Thanks, Philip. So we're now on to chapter 3. Oh, unmute. I'll unmute myself, that will help. We're now on to chapter 3. Do feel free to use those reaction buttons, the thumbs up, thumbs down, or the no mouth as you're hearing the responses. Do you agree? Does this reflect what you've thought? Do you agree with the proposals? So do use those. So we're now moving on to chapter 3 of the consultation paper, which explained the rationale for 2 core premises proposed for the development of NPO financial reporting guidance that are essential to meeting stakeholder and user needs and the 3 guidance objectives. Now, the first core premise is accrual-based accounting. Now, I won't repeat our deep analysis into the advantages and disadvantages of the various accounting bases here, as there is a detailed video on our website and the link is shown there. However, it is worth noting that the issue that we're discussing here is about the accounting basis for entity-wide general purpose financial reports. And while it's linked, that is distinct from the accounting basis that's used in the accounting records during the year or for reports produced for other purposes. So after a great deal of discussion in the advisory groups, a discussion and debate in the advisory groups, we went ahead with accrual-based guidance because it is the best able to meet the project objectives, as you can see on the slide. So in the consultation paper, we asked, what are the challenges associated with accrual-based guidance, to see if we would learn anything else in addition to what we were able to get from the advisory groups. So, in terms of what you said, the challenges reported were indeed mighty, as expected. That said, it was encouraging to note that none of the issues mentioned were very different to those discussed by the advisory groups. The respondents said that smaller, less complex NPOs in particular were unlikely to gain any significant benefit from accrual-based guidance because their transactions could be adequately accounted for on a cash basis. The abilities of users to understand accrual-based financial reports was also raised by other respondents. Furthermore, some donors in particular were only interested in cash-based utilization of funding provided to NPOs. But it was the practical issues with implementation that received the most widespread feedback of any of the questions of part 1. It was raised by a large number of respondents from different professional backgrounds and jurisdictions. So the most common response from people was in relation to the capacity and capability of NPOs and their staff to move to and maintain an accrual-based accounting system. It was noted that many NPOs rely on volunteer. Can you Okay, it was noted that many NPOs rely on volunteers or non-specialist staff who might not have the skills and technical expertise required to operate finance systems on an accrual basis. Or indeed to understand the accrual-based financial reports that they produced. Respondents also commented that access to and the affordability of the education and training needed to apply accrual accounting could be challenging in many jurisdictions. Even more, respondents noted that the resources needed to introduce the computer software and hardware that could be required for accrual accounting would be scarce for many NPOs. And the additional costs associated with compliance and audit of accrual-based financial reports would pose additional burdens. The consultation paper did recognize many of these points, and the feedback from the respondents does really add additional weight to the need that the guidance, the need for us to ensure that the guidance provides for proportionate financial reporting requirements that can be practically applied by a wide range of NPOs in many jurisdictions. So if we think about our way forward, in applying accrual accounting, there are a range of alternatives that can be considered, from the most basic of just recognizing payables and receivables through to more complex areas requiring estimates and judgments. Now, as Karen will be presenting later, we proposed using IFRS for SME as a foundational framework, precisely because it is shorter and simpler than full IFRS, and already removes some of the more onerous accounting and disclosure requirements required by the full suite of standards. So as discussions are made during the guidance development process, we will ensure that the proposals are proportionate to the needs of the preparers and users, keeping the guidance as simple as possible. In this way, we hope that the guidance will be able to be applied by a wide range of NPOs, driving quality. We will also clarify the types of NPO that we have in mind and provide advice for regulators as they consider which NPOs in their jurisdictions should be allowed or required to apply this guidance. And I will be sharing our thoughts on that at the very end. Now, with respect to donors, we convened a donor reference group, and we held the first of many conversations on this specific topic of accounting basis a few days ago in January. Now, it is our core belief over time that greater consistency in reporting requirements will have the effect of reducing reporting burdens. Now, to help stimulate conversations about this within NPOs and between NPOs and funders, Humentum has developed an accounting basis diagnostic tool, which is available for free download from the project website, and you can see the link there. Now, before we move on to narrative reporting, if you'd like to do a thumbs up, thumbs down, or a no mouth, that will give us a temperature check on that. You do that, and I'll hand over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so as Sam noted, chapter 3 of the consultation paper explained the rationale for two core premises proposed for the development of NPO financial reporting guidance. The first, as we have just discussed, is accrual-based accounting, and the second is the inclusion of non-financial reporting information, which is also known as narrative reporting. Now, narrative reporting is necessary to give context to financial information presented in the financial statements and provide additional information about the organization's projects, programs, and wider activities in order to meet broader stakeholder information needs. And we asked what you see as the main challenges with guidance that includes non-financial information reporting. Now, although we were primarily focused on understanding challenges, there was recognition from many respondents that it was important to include non-financial information reporting within the guidance. These respondents agreed that its inclusion would be beneficial in enabling NPO financial reports to meet the broader needs and expectations of users. Several challenges, though, to developing non-financial information reporting principles were raised by respondents. Many highlighted scope, with a need to think carefully about what to include to ensure comparability and consistency between NPOs, whilst also being relevant and applicable across such a diverse range of entities. One respondent indicated that as there are a number of international initiatives ongoing to develop international non-financial reporting frameworks, timing was a critical consideration. They felt the guidance should leverage from these activities, and that while these frameworks were still being developed, it would be useful to focus on high-level principles initially before developing detailed guidance from them. Given the diversity of NPOs and their activities, other respondents also indicated that a careful balance would need to be struck between prescription and flexibility, with NPOs having the freedom to report in a way that best met their users' needs while ensuring consistency in the application of high-level principles. The reliability and integrity of data that would be utilized for non-financial reporting was also noted, including the extent to which it was auditable or subject to other forms of assurance. Respondents also questioned the extent to which non-financial information reporting would build on or integrate with existing NPO performance reporting to donors and other stakeholders. Now, in addition to issues with regard to principles, a number of more practical issues for NPOs in producing and reporting non-financial information were also raised. Many related to the capacity and capability of NPOs to collect, verify, and report relevant data, with respondents noting it can be significantly more difficult to measure non-financial information. This raises issues in relation to cost, skills, and technical expertise that will need to be taken into consideration as guidance is developed, particularly if entities may also be transitioning to accrual-based accounting at the same time. Several respondents also questioned how the guidance would deal with the issue of subjectivity and ensure that NPOs were able to report in a way that was fair and balanced. This links to the challenge noted above about the extent to which non-financial information is auditable or subject to other forms of assurance. It also raises questions as to whether the inclusion of narrative reporting could detract from improvements to financial information reporting. Now, we note the support for the inclusion of non-financial information reporting and recognise the challenges indicated by respondents. As non-financial information reporting proposals are further developed, we will look to ensure that the guidance includes proportionate requirements that can practically be applied by a wide range of NPOs in many jurisdictions. Respondents to Part 1 commenting in this area generally favoured an initial focus on high-level principles for non-financial reporting, rather than the development of a detailed prescriptive framework. This will be taken into consideration when we examine the responses to the alternative presented in Part 2. And I will now hand over to Karen.
Thanks very much, Phil. So let's turn to look at the responses to chapters 4 and 5, which examined the potential basis of the guidance, and that was in chapter 4, and a proposed approach in chapter 5. I think we're all agreed that a solution to the problems facing NPOs and their external stakeholders needs to be developed on a timely basis. And we explained in chapter 4 that developing a brand new set of standards for NPOs is not feasible within the timeframes that we have for the project. And so we concluded in chapter 4 that the guidance must necessarily draw on existing frameworks. We explained in the consultation paper that jurisdictional specific frameworks are not an appropriate base, as they're aimed at providing reporting solution to meet their individual specific needs and are not subject to full international consultation process. So we then looked at available international standards and evaluated them against 3 criteria. That was the extent to which the framework provides guidance on NPO specific issues, familiarity of the frameworks with preparers, auditors, and users, and the feasibility of developing and maintaining the guidance. In our evaluation, Ipsos performed the best in terms of NPO specific issues, as it has standards on things like non-exchange transactions and assets held for social benefit rather than from generating returns. IFRS for SMEs, on the other hand, performed better on familiarity due to the number of entities using those standards, although there was recognition that this is likely to be mixed globally. It also performed better on feasibility because it provides a shorter, simplified standalone standard with reduced disclosure requirements. It's developed in compliance with the IFRS Foundation's due process requirements. It may have acceptable levels of familiarity amongst regulators, preparers, and users internationally. And it was the most feasible solution, as it would require the lowest level of initial and ongoing resource to develop and maintain it. So in the consultation paper, we asked for views on using international frameworks as the start point and for views on the evaluation that we carried out. 90% of respondents agreed that international standards are the best starting point for guidance, with a further 4% partially agreeing. There was strong support for the evaluation of the frameworks, with 85% of respondents agreeing with the criteria to assess their suitability, and 91% agreeing with the assessment that was included in the consultation paper. So in summary, the response that we heard was that the approach was a pragmatic response to the project resource and time constraints, but that an entirely new framework or the use of Ipsos might be preferable. Those that agreed said that they supported the proposals because these frameworks have been developed through extensive consultation and best practice, that it's advantageous to leverage what's already been developed. There is practitioner familiarity, including with funders, as well as there being freely available educational materials already available. However, this was not universally the view, as some respondents felt there would be a need to educate some stakeholders, and that familiarity with the standards is not everywhere, as highlighted in the consultation. A couple of respondents did caution on the need for the guidance to be proportionate, and I think you've heard that before, and echoes as part of that the points that both Sam and Phil have just made. but respondents did note that this approach had been successful in the UK. Regarding the use of jurisdiction standards, some respondents noted that some jurisdictions are further developed than others, and that solutions that exist locally might not be transferable internationally. One respondent who disagreed felt that in terms of developing the guidance, the discussion should start with the characteristics of NPOs. And I think that's consistent with the views expressed that the nature of for-profit organisations and non-profit organisations is different, and that the for-profit frameworks do not have the same focus on accountability and decision-making needed for NPOs, and pointing out that these exist in Ipsos. There was also another comment that projects should ensure that the accounts are suitable for the primary users of the accounts, which is different to all of the current existing international frameworks. So in response to this feedback, we intend that the guidance will be developed using international frameworks as we proposed in the consultation, and that's to ensure that it can be provided as quickly as possible. But we will be using Ipsos where it provides the most appropriate reporting solutions for NPOs. We'll also be framing the guidance around the primary needs of stakeholders, as Phil described earlier. So building on the conclusions from Chapter 4, Chapter 5 proposes a hybrid model that has IFRS for SMEs as a foundational framework. It proposes that IFRS and Ipsos, together with their conceptual frameworks, are used where IFRS for SMEs does not address an NPO-specific issue. With this supported by the NPO-specific guidance that's available from jurisdictions that have developed standards and guidance. It described why this hybrid approach will be better than using a single framework. The chapter also looked at who might benefit from the guidance, particularly as NPOs differ in terms of type, activity, geographic coverage, size, and complexity. So with this coverage, in the consultation paper, we asked what you see as the main challenges, if any, with the proposed guidance model, and the use of IFRS for SMEs as the foundational framework. A number of points were raised in response to this question, and our summary of those main points were that you had concerns with the use of a for-profit framework as the foundation, and that additional clarity was needed on how other frameworks would be used in conjunction with it, and concerns over what the guidance would comprise and cover. Turning to some of those specifically now, in terms of the overall model, respondents raised points about the challenge of how to integrate different principles and guidelines from various sets of frameworks and standards, and ensuring that the final guidance results in a coherent framework. There were some diverse points raised at one end about the risk of specialisation for non-profits when it's not needed. In other words, that there might be unnecessary departures from existing international standards. But at the same time, points raised about the need for NPO-specific issues to be tackled. A point was raised about the potential lack of consistency if jurisdictions make significant amendments as they take on the guidance. And there was also a question about whether there would be a rebuttable assumption about IFRS for SME standard being used as the basis for the guidance on NPO-specific issues. So a range of points raised. And building on the point about specialisation, feedback also included the need to identify where the guidance will be different to IFRS for SMEs, and for there to be a clear rationale included about why these differences are needed. IBSASB has a model that it uses for deciding when something is needed specifically for the public sector, and it was suggested that a similar model is used for the NPO guidance. In terms of the use of IFRS for SMEs as the foundational framework, the feedback centred on concerns about the cost of adoption, the need for education and training, potential complexity, particularly with the use of fair value measurement, the potential for increased volatility of profit and loss, and the potential for tax implication. There was also a concern about the framing of public accountability for non-profits and whether that is compatible with IFRS for SMEs. In other words, the concern that IFRS for SMEs has been developed for for-profit making entities, as I described earlier. As with Chapter 4, comments included that IPSAS standards should be used as an alternative approach. And those supporting that approach commented that by including IPSASB's conceptual framework, this would align more closely with the objectives of the project and characteristics of NPOs. From a stakeholder perspective, feedback included concern about the acceptability of the model to donors, as well as comments about the need to demonstrate the benefits of the model to different stakeholders. There are a number of questions about the guidance itself, with questions about whether guidance would be in the form of interpretations, be a standalone document, or take the form of annotations to IFRS for SME standard itself. There was also feedback about there being sufficient clarity of the target audience so that user needs can be clarified. And it was suggested that a suitable group of NPOs be identified as a reference point. Comments were also made that by fragmenting the guidance, perhaps between simple or complex NPOs, it might weaken the overall model. And related to this was concerns about the potential impact on smaller entities, and as a consequence, whether there should be tiered reporting. So in response to this feedback, we as a project will be engaging further with the NPO community on these concerns. And we are planning a webinar in the coming months to have a deeper discussion about some of the feedback that we received and the sometimes opposing comments that were included within that. So our focus will be on ensuring that with the IFRS for SME standard as the foundation and framework, we provide a standalone set of guidance with an NPO appropriate focus that makes use of all of the frameworks to provide NPO specific reporting solutions. We'll also ensure that it's clear which organisations we have in mind when developing the guidance.
Sorry, Karen, I muted you because there's a lot of background noise.
Sorry, I've just unmuted myself again. So I'm just going to pause there because we would like to do a brief poll to get your thoughts on this, and in particular, the use of IFRS for SMEs as a foundational framework. And we've got the following poll question for you, which hopefully will appear on your screen very shortly. And there's just...
Can I just ask Josephina as host, can you relaunch the poll? And then we should see it.
Yes.
Great. So there will be 3 potential answers that you can give to the poll when we can see it. And you can tick all of them if you choose, or as many that apply. And so we want to know whether you agree with IFRS for SMEs as the foundational framework, whether you've still got questions and reservations, or you're just looking forward to the webinar to have a further conversation about this. So a quick temperature check that we'd like to take. I'll just give you a few seconds to put in some responses to that.
Josephina, at the bottom, you need to click reshare because I tested it earlier. It should come up.
Okay.
Okay, I clicked that, so you can't see the poll, and Karen, you can't see it either?
I can see the poll, and I think a number of people are responding to it. I think
Perfect.
81 responses so far, so I'll just give it
looks good.
a few more seconds for just to read and put in their responses. Okay, I might just pause that. Oh, there's still a few more streaming in. Okay, I'm just going to pause it at that point and I'll end the poll. So apologies if you haven't had a chance to get your response in. So just under 60% of you, 59% of you are agreeing with IFRS for SMEs as the most appropriate framework. But 20% of you have still got questions and reservations, and nearly half of you would like to have the opportunity to attend the webinar and discuss this further. So I think that sort of captures our thoughts about the need for this to be a broader conversation and to keep talking about it. And we're looking forward to engaging you with you on that. So I'm going to now hand back to Sam to talk about part 2.
Well, thank you, Karen. We've actually got time for some questions and comments now.
Great.
So we really would love to hear your questions and comments, especially on anything related to the project in general or what we've shared about the feedback from part 1. If you can use the raise hand function, hopefully we'll be able to see you and bring you in to raise your question. If you have a question in French, Spanish or Arabic, please can you type it in the chat and the interpreters will translate it in the chat and we can bring it in that way. So please do, we'd love to hear from you. Any questions or comments on who are NPOs, stakeholders and their information needs, accrual basis, narrative reporting, the use of international frameworks and the bespoke model.
Sam, I can't see any questions at the moment. Perhaps if people are uncomfortable asking a question, perhaps they can kind of give us some reactions. Oh, we have a couple of questions.
Janine, do come in.
Hi. So, oh, you know what? I hope you can hear me okay. I don't have my earphones in. Okay. I think the bespoke model is an excellent idea. I'm going through an Ipsos US GAAP to Ipsos conversion right now in Tanzania, and Ipsos is just way too much. I think it's good that there's a recognition that yes, NPOs have accountability, but public sector accountability is a whole different animal, right? So I'm very happy with this bespoke model.
Thanks, Janine, for sharing. That's super. Pesh, do you want to come in?
Good morning. This is Fernando Catacora from the US. Hi, Sam. Hi, Karen. Hi, everybody.
We'll just let Pesh come in first, Fernando. Just a second.
Thanks. Thanks. I was thinking about who can use this, because at the moment in some jurisdictions, so for example in the UK, the charity SOAP, you can use it if you're not a charity. So you might be a community interest company, which is not a charity, but you have all the characteristics. So you might be a social enterprise, and you think it's best used in that way. Why I'm asking this is increasingly I am seeing organizations that may not tick all those boxes that we had on there. So they may have some investments which are being used for different purposes or something of that kind. But to all intents and purpose, they are analogous to a not-for-profit organization.
Super. Thanks, Pesh. That's really helpful. Great. Fernando, would you like to come in?
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm Fernando from the US, Caracora. I just want to share that, you know, as we all may all know, the IFRS framework, both full IFRS and small and medium entities, are based on that concept of for-profit work. You know, and this is a question that may have been asked at the very early stage of the project. but you guys are developing a very nice accounting framework for the nonprofit world. So do you have that in mind? So is it late to think about that? You know, that's something that I just want to share with the audience, you know, because it's just that. And also my the second part of my question, just sharing our proposal is that, have you considered this new environmental, well, not new, not really new, but environmental reporting for nonprofit? Because we all know, we have some experience on the nonprofit world. We know that a lot of nonprofit entities are related to the environment, all these requirements. So that's just sharing with the audience.
That's great. Karen, do you want to come back on those three and then we can take some more?
Actually, I was going to ask if Phil would like to respond to those particular points, but I'm happy to do so if not.
I think I'm probably best able to respond to Pesh's comment on who can use, because I've been writing a draft of the application guidance that kind of gets into these sort of entities that may or may not be able to apply the guidance. So, I mean, ultimately, this is non-authoritative guidance. It would be for jurisdictions to decide whether it's applicable to entities in their jurisdictions or not. What we're looking to do is, through the broad characteristics, explain the kinds of entities we have in mind when we're developing the guidance and the standards. And it's then for jurisdictions to determine whether there are certain entities in those jurisdictions that it should apply to. What I will say is that the application guidance gives, I'm developing some examples of things like social enterprises or entities that might have the kind of hybrid model of some profit making and some more sort of charitable purposes, where the broad characteristics may not be fully met, but if you look into the other indicators and get a sort of feel of the entity, then a jurisdiction may actually determine, yes, these standards and this guidance will be appropriate for them. But again, it will be for that individual jurisdiction to decide. We, as a secretariat and a project team, have no authority and no basis on which to say X and Y should or shouldn't apply this guidance.
Yeah, and just to build on that, of course, that will depend on kind of the legal framework in particular jurisdictions, and that's why we can't be absolute, but we're trying to draft things in a broad way and to really signal our intent, and we then will want to work with jurisdictions to try and explain that, so that we really try and get to the heart of who these nonprofits are. Fernando, to your kind of question about sort of the for-profit and non-profit, I mean, that's very much at the heart of our considerations. And as we look at who is this guidance, who are the stakeholders that are interested in the financial statements and reports that come from this, we've got them very much in mind and thinking about what is useful for them. And so we will be examining those aspects to determine what's appropriate or what we think is appropriate for nonprofits. And you raised the point about environmental sustainability reporting, really globally a really huge topic, and that's absolutely something that we need to think about when we look at the scope of narrative reporting. I think Phil mentioned that earlier when he was talking about it. We're going to need to decide, you know, what do we think is appropriate at this point in time, and whether we can define principles that enable rather than restrict, because some elements are going to be more appropriate for some entities than for others. Hopefully that helps.
Brilliant, thank you so much. There's just a couple of questions one question in the chat I wanted to deal with, and then we'll bring in Naima and Evelyn. Somebody asked me if the members of the donor reference group are publicly available, and it is on the website, the IFR4NPO.org website. There's a tab called Community, and there you can see the donor reference group, and the donors that are in the group are listed there. It includes USAID and FCDO in the UK and World Bank, as well as a number of foundations. And we are also recruiting new members to that. Let's bring in Naima. Would you like to come in? Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Sam. I would like to ask a question regarding the position of the donor reference group. Could you explain again what was their position, please? Thank you.
They certainly didn't have a position on a counting basis. I would say we are just beginning to scratch the surface of a really, really interesting debate. The donor reference group meetings aren't recorded and they're not public, really just to help us create a really safe space for them. So I won't say too much, but we will be writing a paper which will be agreed with donor reference group members that we can publish. One that's coming out soon will be on our conversation about how donors use general purpose financial reports. And the next one will be the beginnings of our conversation on a counting basis. So that's all I can say at this point, but it's a long journey. We certainly have, there's no one answer or one way forward, but it's a very active and valuable conversation. Let me say that. Thank you. And Evelyn, would you like to come in?
Yes, so my name is Evelyn and I'm from Kenya. I'm an auditor. So most of the time we find ourselves auditing the NPOs in accordance with the applicable IFRSs and the gaps. So, and most of also the donations are usually guided by the budgets that are in place. So when we are talking about the accrual, then how will we now marry the accrual basis and the budgets that have to be pre-approved before our expenditure?
That is exactly at the heart of some of these very real challenges. If your budget signed off by your donor is on a cash basis, and yet your general purpose reports are on an accrual basis, these are some of the issues that we'll be looking at. And it's this distinction between the report that goes to your donor, which is against your budget in whatever basis, and the annual audited accounts for the entity as a whole, because every donor has different requirements and some donors require this and others require that. So what we're looking at and focusing on here is the general purpose financial statements for the organization as a whole. And that you've really hit at the heart of some of the very real questions that we'll be looking at in a lot of detail. So thanks for that, Evelyn. There's a couple more just that I've seen in the chat. We'll just do those and then we can move on. We're still doing very well for time. David Hardage asked, will narrative reporting be part of the proposed initial version of the guidance, given the lack of current frameworks, or will it be delayed? So quite a practical process question.
Sam, would you like me to answer to that, given that I'm starting to draft it? So we do have it is part of the sort of initial, if I can get the terminology right, tranche of issues that we are looking at, because we're trying to sort of, in the first set of exposure drafts, have the kind of overall framework for you to look at and respond to. We are very conscious, and Karen will look at this a little later in examining the part 2 responses, that there did seem to be a preference for a more high-level principles approach, which would tend to indicate that we'll be looking to provide a sort of framework of high-level principles that people may be able to sort of plug and play different frameworks into, but this is still a very early stage, and this is one area where I think we are going to have to run some focus groups and look in more detail